Presley knew the truth about Elvis's marriage and stayed silent. There's a photograph from 1967 that most people glance past without thinking twice. Elvis and Priscilla on their wedding day, smiling for the cameras, the flashbulbs catching that famous face at the peak of his charm. But if you look just beyond the frame, just past the staged perfection of that Las Vegas ceremony, you'll find another face. Older, quieter, harder to read. Vernon Presley, standing where he always stood, close enough to see everything, far enough to never be the center of attention. His expression in that photograph isn't joy. It isn't pride. It's something else entirely. Something guarded. Something watchful. And if you understand who Vernon Presley really was, that look tells you more about Elvis's marriage than 100 interviews ever could. Vernon wasn't simply Elvis's father. He was the architect of the empire's daily machinery. The man who signed the checks and reviewed the contracts and knew exactly where every dollar went. When Elvis bought Graceland, it was Vernon who managed it. When Elvis hired someone new, Vernon approved them. When deals were negotiated, tours were scheduled, or problems needed quiet solutions, Vernon handled it all with the steady, unflappable efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that survival depended on staying useful. He had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, had served time in prison for a desperate check fraud scheme that nearly destroyed his family, and had watched his wife Gladys die in a way that shattered both him and his son. By the time Elvis stood at that altar in 1967, Vernon had rebuilt his entire existence around one singular purpose, protecting his son's success at all costs. That protection extended far beyond finances. Vernon understood the entertainment industry in ways that Elvis, wrapped up in the performance and the adoration, often didn't. He knew that scandal could end a career overnight. He knew that the wrong headline, the wrong photograph, the wrong whisper in the wrong ear could unravel everything they had built. And he knew, standing at that wedding, watching his son marry a 21-year-old woman who had been waiting for this moment since she was 14 years old, that this marriage carried risks Elvis hadn't fully considered. Priscilla was young and sheltered and deeply in love with an idea of Elvis that the real man could never consistently be. Elvis was restless and driven, and surrounded by people who enabled his every impulse. Vernon saw the collision coming long before anyone else admitted it was possible. What made Vernon's position so uniquely painful was the depth of his love for both of them. He genuinely cared for Priscilla. He had watched her grow up in Elvis's orbit, had seen her patience and devotion, had recognized in her the kind of steadiness that his own late wife Gladys had possessed. Vernon understood what Priscilla represented, a chance for Elvis to have something real, something grounding, something separate from the chaos of fame. And yet Vernon also knew his son. He knew the restlessness, the insatiable hunger for stimulation, the way Elvis could make someone feel like the center of the universe one moment and completely invisible the next. These weren't flaws Vernon could fix. They were simply who Elvis was. And so Vernon watched and waited and kept his observations to himself. Years later, long after the marriage had collapsed and Elvis had spiraled into darker places, people who worked closely with Vernon would recall a conversation that stayed with them. It happened sometime in the mid-1970s, after the divorce was final, and the tabloids had moved on to new scandals. Vernon was speaking quietly to an old associate, someone who had been around since the early days. The associate asked Vernon directly what had really happened between Elvis and Priscilla, expecting the usual deflection, the polite non-answer. Instead, Vernon paused for a long moment, his face heavy with something that looked almost like grief. And then he said something the associate never forgot. People think they know what happened between those two. They don't know the half of it, and I'm not going to be the one to tell them. Through every interview request, every biographer's inquiry, every family conversation that veered too close to the truth, Vernon maintained his silence. He took what he knew about Elvis's marriage, about the love and the failures and the private devastation on both sides, and he buried it deep where no journalist could reach. Some people called it loyalty, others called it complicity. But whatever you call it, one thing remains undeniable. Vernon Presley understood his son's marriage in ways the public never did. And the question that still haunts anyone who looks closely at this story is simple. What exactly did Vernon see behind those closed doors that he was so determined to protect? The wedding photographs told one story. The years that followed told another entirely. From the outside, Elvis and Priscilla Presley looked like American royalty settling into domestic bliss. The mansion, the daughter, the matching smiles at carefully orchestrated public appearances. But Vernon, who moved through Graceland's hallways with the quiet authority of a man who belonged there, saw what the cameras never captured. He saw the empty chairs at dinner tables when Elvis was on tour for months at a time. He saw Priscilla wandering the house like a ghost in her own home, surrounded by Elvis's entourage but utterly alone. He saw the distance growing between his son and daughter-in-law, not in dramatic confrontations, but in the slow accumulation of silence, of missed conversations, of two people occupying the same space without ever truly meeting. Elvis's schedule in those years was relentless in ways that would break most marriages under far less pressure. The Las Vegas residencies alone demanded months of performance, night after night. The same songs, the same crowds, the same isolation in hotel suites, surrounded by hired company. Between Vegas came the tours, the recording sessions, the obligations that never seemed to end. When Elvis finally came home to Graceland, he rarely arrived as a husband returning to his wife. He arrived as a performer still wired from the stage, surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, keeping hours that made normal conversation impossible. He slept until mid-afternoon. He stayed awake until dawn. He filled the house with noise and people and activity that somehow left Priscilla feeling more invisible than the silence ever had. Vernon witnessed all of it from his unique vantage point. He managed the finances, which meant he knew precisely where the money flowed and to whom. He approved the travel arrangements, which meant he understood the logistics of Elvis's life in ways that revealed patterns Priscilla might only have suspected. The gifts that appeared on credit card statements. The flights booked for companions whose names never made it into official records. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when certain people entered the room. Vernon was not naive. He had spent enough years navigating his son's world to recognize the shape of what was happening, even when no one spoke of it directly. The other women were not a secret within Elvis's inner circle. They were simply an unspoken reality that everyone acknowledged through careful silence. What made Vernon's position so agonizing was the impossibility of intervention. This was not a normal family where a father could pull his son aside and demand accountability. Elvis was the center of gravity around which everyone else orbited. His moods dictated the atmosphere of every room he entered. His approval determined who stayed in the inner circle and who was cast out without warning. Vernon had spent years learning how to navigate this dynamic, how to offer counsel without threatening, how to remain essential without becoming a target. Confronting Elvis directly about his marriage, about the infidelities, about the way he was slowly suffocating the woman who had given up everything to be with him, carried risks Vernon understood too well. He could speak and be ignored. He could push and be shut out entirely. Or he could remain silent and keep his place beside his son, hoping that somehow the situation would resolve itself. Years later, after one particularly tense visit to Graceland during the marriage's final gasping months, Vernon reportedly confided something to a longtime family friend. He said he didn't recognize his son anymore. Not the fame or the costumes or the stage persona. Those he had long accepted as necessary fictions. What troubled Vernon was something deeper. The man underneath was disappearing. Elvis was retreating into a version of himself that no one could reach. Not Priscilla, not Vernon, not anyone who had known him before the world discovered his name. The marriage, which should have anchored Elvis to something real, had instead become another weight dragging him beneath the surface. Vernon saw his son drowning in slow motion, and the most devastating part was knowing that nothing he said would be enough to pull him back. The year 1972 arrived, carrying a weight that would reshape everything Vernon had spent years trying to hold together. Priscilla had reached the end of what she could endure. Not dramatically, not with the explosive confrontation the tabloids would have loved to report, but with the quiet devastation of a woman who had finally accepted that loving Elvis Presley was not enough to save their marriage. When she told Elvis she was leaving, the reaction was not what anyone expected. The man who commanded stadiums, who made millions of people scream his name, who seemed untouchable in his fame, simply broke. Vernon was nearby when the news shattered his son's world. He watched Elvis crumble in ways the public would never witness, ways that no performance could mask, ways that revealed just how much Priscilla had meant to the man beneath the legend. In the aftermath of the separation and the divorce that followed, Vernon's role expanded beyond anything he had previously managed. He became the shield between Elvis and the chaos threatening to consume him. The legal arrangements required coordination with attorneys who understood that discretion was worth more than their hourly fees. The property divisions demanded careful negotiation to protect assets Elvis barely thought about in his grief. The custody agreements for Lisa Marie, still a young child caught between two parents whose love for her was the only thing they still fully shared, required delicacy that Vernon provided without complaint. He handled the press inquiries with practiced deflection, offering nothing that could become a headline, revealing nothing that might feed the tabloid machinery already circling his family like vultures. But beneath the logistics and the legal maneuvering, Vernon played a deeper role that no contract could define. He became the vessel for his son's pain. Elvis raged in those months, blamed everyone around him, wept with an intensity that frightened the people closest to him, and refused to accept that his own choices had contributed to the collapse. Vernon absorbed it all without pushing back. He listened to the accusations without correcting them. He stood steady while Elvis unleashed grief that had no productive outlet, understanding that his son needed someone to receive the weight he could not carry alone. It was not a comfortable role. It was not a role Vernon had ever wanted, but it was the role his son needed, and Vernon fulfilled it with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else. What complicated Vernon's position was his genuine respect for Priscilla. He understood what she had sacrificed in ways that Elvis, wrapped in his own perspective, often failed to acknowledge. She had entered his world as a teenager, had surrendered her independence and identity to become the wife of the most famous man in America, and had endured years of loneliness that would have destroyed someone with less resolve. When the marriage ended, Vernon did not vilify her publicly or privately. He maintained a careful distance that honored what she had meant to his son, while respecting the boundaries the divorce required. Some who knew Vernon well suspected that he sympathized with Priscilla more than he ever admitted. She had done what Vernon himself could never do. She had set a boundary with Elvis and walked away. In her courage, Vernon perhaps saw a reflection of the strength he wished he possessed. As the years passed and the divorce settled into history, Vernon's silence on the subject only deepened. Journalists approached him with questions designed to extract controversy. Biographers pressed for details that would have sold thousands of books. Even family members, curious about what had really happened behind those closed doors, found themselves redirected with vague responses about love being complicated and private matters deserving privacy. Vernon never contradicted Elvis's version of events, never offered his own interpretation, never revealed the private conversations or the moments of vulnerability that might have reshaped public understanding. He chose protection over truth, loyalty over legacy. And by the time Elvis died in 1977, the full story of the marriage remained locked inside the one man who had witnessed it from beginning to end. Vernon took those secrets with him, not because he didn't care about truth, but because he understood that some truths belong only to the people who lived them. Understanding Vernon Presley's silence requires understanding the kind of loyalty that most people never have to test. This was not the casual allegiance of a business partner or the professional discretion of a hired manager. This was something far deeper, forged in poverty and prison and the shared grief of losing Gladys, the woman who had held their small family together through impossible circumstances. Vernon had watched his son transform from a shy boy in Tupelo into the most recognizable human being on the planet. He had witnessed that transformation consume everything in its path, including the marriages and relationships and quiet moments that normal people take for granted. By the time Elvis and Priscilla's marriage collapsed, Vernon had spent decades protecting something larger than any single relationship. He was protecting the idea of Elvis itself, the mythology that had rescued their family from obscurity and given them everything they possessed. To threaten that idea, even with truth, was unthinkable for Vernon. He understood what the public wanted from Elvis, the fantasy of the charming rebel, the devoted performer, the man who could make anyone feel special with a single glance. Revealing the complications of Elvis's marriage, the infidelities and the loneliness and the ways both partners had failed each other would have introduced shades of gray into a story the world preferred in black and white. Vernon recognized that truth, in this context, was not a gift. It was a weapon capable of wounding his son's legacy in ways that could never be repaired. And so he chose silence, not from weakness or cowardice, but from a love so consuming that it overrode every other consideration, including his own need to be understood. The scope of what Vernon knew extended far beyond any single incident or revelation. He understood the full architecture of the marriage's failure, the small betrayals and the large ones, the moments when reconciliation seemed possible, and the moments when the distance became permanent. He knew about the other women, not as rumors but as logistical realities he had helped manage through financial oversight and travel arrangements. He knew about Priscilla's isolation, the way she had been sidelined in her own home, made to feel like an accessory rather than a partner. But he also knew about the tenderness that existed between them, the genuine love that had drawn them together, and the genuine grief that accompanied its ending. Vernon held these contradictions without attempting to resolve them because he understood that the truth about Elvis and Priscilla could never be reduced to a simple narrative. When Vernon died in 1979, just 2 years after his son, those contradictions died with him. Biographers rushed to fill the void with speculation and second-hand accounts. Tabloids continued their endless appetite for scandal, manufacturing stories from fragments and innuendo. Priscilla eventually published her own memoir, offering her perspective on a marriage that had defined and nearly destroyed her. Her version became the dominant narrative by default, not because it was incomplete, but because it was the only comprehensive account available. Vernon's perspective, the view from the one person who had witnessed everything without being directly consumed by it, vanished into history. The questions he could have answered, the context he could have provided, the humanity he could have restored to a story, often reduced to celebrity gossip, all of it was lost because Vernon chose silence over revelation. Perhaps that was the greatest gift Vernon ever gave his son. Not protection from scandal, though he provided that too, but something more profound. He gave Elvis the right to be remembered as Elvis wanted to be remembered, imperfect but beloved, troubled but triumphant, a man whose music mattered more than his mistakes. Vernon could have reshaped that legacy with a single interview, a single moment of candor that would have echoed through every biography written afterward. He chose instead to let the silence speak for itself, to carry his knowledge to the grave rather than burden the world with complications it might not have been ready to receive. Whether you view that choice as noble sacrifice or tragic missed opportunity depends entirely on what you believe truth owes to the people it concerns. Vernon made his decision, and he never once looked back. What do you think Vernon knew that he never shared? Was his silence the ultimate act of love, or a truth the world deserved to hear? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if these untold stories resonate with you, subscribe now. There is so much more hidden inside the Elvis legacy waiting to be uncovered.